Good evening. I'm Barbara Romzek. I'm Dean of the School of Public Affairs at American University, which is home to the Center for Environmental Policy and host of tonight's Scher Sustainability Forum. I want to thank you all for joining us this evening. This is one of the special events that the Center for Environmental Policy puts on and that the School of Public Affairs is very proud of, because it represents an opportunity to engage the policy community with important work being done in the area, bringing in practitioners from the government and the business sector, and that's what we pride ourselves on doing, is being able to convene important conversations on pressing policy issues of the day. It's wonderful to see such a mix of people representing both public and private sector here tonight. The Scher Sustainability Forum was established by Peter Scher, who is a graduate of the School of Public Affairs, and his wife, Kim Tilley. Their passion for environmental responsibility in both the public and private sector inspired this wonderful series. We want to thank Peter for his generosity and vision and the leadership it shows in putting an investment in this important subject matter. So tonight's event is the second in a series which explores the pressing environmental and energy policy issues of our time. And it gives us a platform to highlight the best practices in sustainability. As you know, these are challenging times for us, American politics, for our citizens, and certainly for the management of the environment. Sustainability has never been more important. Many of the threats we face in the world today are a complex mix of environmental, social, and economic factors, and we need to recognize that if we're going to make sustained headway on sustainability. So tonight, we're going to talk about ways the United States can invest in its future by exploring finance models that can mitigate the impacts of climate change. Now, of course, stabilizing the global climate is one of the most urgent challenges of today and into the future. Our warming world affects all people and all places, but particularly the poor, who already suffer disproportionately from climate change impacts. So there are environmental issues and there are social issues, and they come together with this kind of an issue. So here in the United States, climate change directly affects a wide range of government services, not to mention national security, government operations, business operations. Recognizing this, President Obama directed federal agencies to cut waste, pollution, and costs of federal operations. He also emphasized the need to scale up financial commitments to new technologies that can mitigate the impacts of climate change. By integrating these investment strategies into planning, the United States can hope to ensure that these resources will be used in a more proactive way to address issues of climate change as much as we can while the climate is changing. So we've got a dynamic system where the change is happening, we need to arrest it, we need to recognize it's going to continue to change as we try to arrest. Of course, I'm talking to people who already know this. So I look forward to hearing the discussion tonight about our challenges in the environment. I was going to recognize Peter Scher, but something has come up and he's not going to be able to be here tonight. So now I turn it over to our moderator for tonight's event, the director of the Center for Environmental Policy and executive in residence at the School of Public Affairs. That's Dan Fiorino. Now let me just say a few words about Dan. He joined the School of Public Affairs in 2009 after a career at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. I know many of you know him from that time, where he directed award-winning policy programs and departments. He now teaches at the School of Public Affairs on sustainability, environmental policy, energy and climate change, and more. Now, please join me in giving a warm welcome to our panelists and to Dan, who will introduce them. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Romzek. It's great to see you all here tonight for the second Scher Sustainability Forum. Our topic, of course, is private-public financing for global sustainability. In its 2011 report towards a green economy, the United Nations Environment Program asserted that investing 2% of global GDP into 10 key sectors could kickstart a transition towards a low-carbon, resource-efficient economy. So that's a little under $2 trillion US. So whether that's enough, it's feasible or not, is maybe something that we'll get to. They asserted also this amount can be mobilized by smart public policy and innovative financing mechanisms. So tonight, we're going to talk about innovative financing mechanisms and maybe a little bit about public policy as well. We have three very experienced and innovative leaders in the field, so let me briefly introduce them. So our format is that I'll do some quick introductions now. Terry Tamminen will give you an overview. We're not just talking about the Terry's project, but we're sort of using that as a case to build on in our discussion. So great pleasure to have with us tonight Lynn Scarlett. I have heard of Lynn for many years, but the first time I got to meet her. She's the managing director for global public policy at the Nature Conservancy. Her job is to build the Conservancy's capacity to influence policy around the world. You have more detailed bios, but previously she was Deputy Secretary at the Department of the Interior, visiting scholar at Resources for the Future, has worked in areas of landscape scale conservation, climate change adaptation, greening of business and infrastructure, wildlife, energy, and water issues. And I noticed she's a fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration, so I'll be seeing you at some of those sessions. Also with us tonight is William K. Reilly. Bill Reilly is now the senior advisor to TPG Capital, an international investment partnership. From 1998 to 2010, Bill was the founding partner of Aqua International Partners, a private equity fund dedicated to investing in companies in the water sector. We, of course, know many other important roles that Bill has played: administrator of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, president of World Wildlife and Conservation Funds, co-chair of President Obama's National Commission on the Deepwater Horizon oil spill and offshore drilling. Also, for the past 4 years, we at American University have been working with Bill in establishing the William K. Reilly Fund for Environmental Governance and Leadership, which has been a great joy. Through that and Bill's support, we've granted many scholarships to students, internships to provide our students with experience mostly in non-governmental organizations, but we're placed our first one with a local government this year, a series of national leadership awards, policy forums around the country on a variety of issues. Last year, Bill was the commencement speaker for the School of Public Affairs, and the president and trustees of American University granted him an honorary Doctor of Public Service degree. We also just sort of finished editing and will make available a video that we did with Bill on his experience at EPA, and we hope to maybe do that with other EPA administrators, but we'll be sending around the link so you can take a look at that. And then finally, Terry Tamminen. Terry currently has many roles. He's a strategic advisor to the founding chair of the R20 Regions of Climate Action, created by California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger and others to help subnational governments around the world develop low-carbon and climate-resilient economic development projects. Previously was Secretary of the California Department of Environmental Protection and later Cabinet Secretary and Chief Policy Advisor to Governor Schwarzenegger. And it does lots of other stuff as well. What's not obvious, if you look at Terry's background, is, among other things, he has been a sheep rancher. He is a licensed ship captain and plane and helicopter pilot. He helped Nigeria create its first recycling program. He's the author of several books, including guides to pools and spas, and on several theatrical works on the life of William Shakespeare. So remember those commercials about the most interesting man in the world? Terry Tamminen.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction, and I'm sure half of it is true. I'm in a room full of so many people I admire. Joel Reynolds from NRDC is here, Lynn, of course, so many other folks, but one of my real heroes is Bill Reilly. When I was EPA Secretary and I was completely unprepared to do this job, I always thought every single day, what would Bill do? I'm serious. And tried to model our actions to be practical and results-oriented. And so to this day, I wish more people would listen to Bill Reilly. Give him a great big round of applause. I will be brief because, as you heard, this little case study I'm going to present is not really what we're going to focus on, but it is just that, a case study. So, so I was asked to do that, and I'll do that. Let's see if I can get this to work. Oh, maybe it's the other direction. Yep. No, no, that's the... No. Forward. Well, that's back. Okay. It's always about the technology, isn't it? In addition to, while he's doing that, the part of the resume that may not be public yet, but I'll share with you, and the reason that unfortunately I have to really jet out of here at 7:30, so if there's follow-up questions or discussions, I'll be happy to do that offline with you, and you can get my contact information from Danielle or others. But the reason is I've got to get to a plane to go to Europe. I am now going to be working with Leonardo DiCaprio and building his foundation and building a fund that's actually modeled very much on what you're going to see here tonight with major philanthropists. So, so the world is looking for these solutions. So first of all, you know, just as the title implies, we need trillions, not billions, if we're going to solve our environmental problems. And so briefly about the R20, it was, as Dan mentioned, a nonprofit organization founded when we left state government to work with states and provinces all over the world to do what California had done, but also for California and others to learn from other subnational governments on policy, technology, and finance. And we know, as a result of this work, as Christiana Figueres said, that there is an enormous amount of capital that's going to be needed if we're going to move our economy from brown to green. We did this report, which you can download online, for COP21, which was a status report on climate finance and an action plan, which is the action plan part I'll present briefly tonight. But what we found, of course, was that governments have growing problems with these issues and are trying to solve them with clean technology and renewable energy and energy efficiency and fuel switching and so forth. Companies have that technology. Projects need financing and very often can't get it in different parts of the world. Financial institutions all say they want to go green. Talk to any pension fund, they'll all say that, but they'll all say they're struggling in different asset classes to find things that meet their risk-reward profile. And many similar reports in the past have suggested that investors should take higher risk and lower returns. That's just not the world we live in. And public aid sources have been helpful, but are obviously very limited. And barriers exist, despite the fact that there's a great appetite for green investing and green projects, not the least of which is that in various parts of the world there's significant sovereign risk, there's technology risk and policies, of course. Investors in particular are always saying, well, let's see how long that government policy lasts. We've got plenty of examples of that here in this country with production tax credits and other kinds of tax credit programs. Charitable funding is way too small. Donations are intermittent. You can read the list there. There's plenty of challenges to moving from billions to trillions. So what we came up with was this notion for a green investment accelerator fund, where the green investment would develop, would invest in projects in areas where the governments were welcoming. And that was one thing about going from 20 subnational governments when we started R20, R meaning regional. Originally 20 included California, British Columbia, Delta State, and Nigeria, et cetera. Going from 20 to over 500 is that now with 500, we can find the most supporting and ready governments. We don't have to try to fit a square peg in a round hole. We can find the ones that are willing to put the correct policies in place and to try to streamline the process to getting projects done in their region. We also decided to focus on some key sectors that could scale up quickly. So for example, everybody wants to do energy efficiency as low-hanging fruit to quickly save energy, save money, reduce greenhouse gases from the production of energy. But they look at buildings like this, and every single building is different. So it requires an investment-grade audit that's expensive and time-consuming. And of course, there's disconnects. Sometimes the owner of the building doesn't pay the electricity, so there's no motivation for the owner to do the efficiency upgrades and so on. So we said, well, what could you do that was cookie cutter that would actually move much more quickly? And we discovered streetlights, which is a project I'll show you briefly in Brazil as a case study of a case study. And that very quickly you can determine if a city has old streetlights that could be upgraded to LEDs, which today could save enough money in energy costs and maintenance to pay for that retrofit, and obviously creates a lot of local jobs. And that kind of a thing with a nonprofit where we put together a team can go anywhere in the world and help a local government do that. And we found that in some cases, the city itself uses as much as 60% of the city's energy budget is for street lighting. And so it can have a material effect for taxpayers as well. Accelerator, of course, to speed up the pace of business as usual. And again, at market risk and market rate return so that you can actually attract institutional capital and not just sort of donor and program-related investing. And then a fund structure where, in essence, this would be a fund of funds because no one's going to mistake a nonprofit for being a seasoned investment professional. But in fact, there are many funds that are investing in solar development in Africa, working with Rothschild Bank and lots of other institutions that know what they're doing. And there's no reason that you can't piggyback on that sort of thing. Our model shows that you could raise $1 billion and, as you can see, turn it into $5 billion worth of investment in a 15-year life of the fund with a very generous return. And people say, wow, if you can get that kind of return, count me in. I mean, not many people are finding 15% and actually doing good for the planet. And R20 itself has quite a few projects that have already demonstrated this, which is again why we felt comfortable to now go out and raise a fund around this idea, because we've done it with utility scale solar, with retrofits, as I mentioned, of streetlights, with converting waste into value. And waste, by the way, I think is the biggest opportunity that is the least discussed and least understood, because everyone says, oh, let's get solar, let's get wind, let's get clean fuels and electric cars, but they don't stop to realize how much in every country, developed and developing, we are simply throwing away, and in many cases letting it rot into methane, which, as you know, is many times more potent as a heat-trapping gas than CO2. So we know it can be done, that these projects have those kinds of returns and can be de-risked. But as a part of COP21, the Secretary General of the UN created something called the Cities Climate Finance Leadership Alliance and actually asked the R20 to run it because of its experience in actually developing these kinds of projects. And now this list is, there's about 20 other institutions that have been added to it. These development banks, UN agencies, NGOs have never been coordinated before. So a UN Habitat or UN Development Agency may have great projects on the ground in sub-Saharan Africa. They're desperate for capital. They don't have anybody that understands financing and can actually access the capital at these development banks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we're now coordinating all of these institutions to help them find the kinds of large-scale, low-carbon economic development projects that we feature in this paper and enjoy the results. So one quick example, and then I'll stop and we'll get our panelists up here. So the city of Rio de Janeiro wanted to replace its 400,000 inefficient streetlights with LEDs, but they couldn't afford them because they were all imported. Brazil doesn't make its own streetlights. And so the imports were subject to heavy import duties. And the second problem was they didn't trust the technology. They had seen cities, even like Los Angeles, where I live, that had started in 2008 replacing inefficient streetlights, but they burned out ahead of the warranties and there were technology failures. And the third piece was, even if they could afford it, they didn't have the bonding capacity to do it all at once because they're spending money on the World Cup and the Olympics and so forth. So we went down there, we brought manufacturers to Brazil and found one that lights the space station, amongst other things, who got into business with local electronics manufacturers. It's not worrying about making lights, because these are sophisticated electronics products, and there's a lot of electronics manufacturers in Brazil. So we got those partners together and got them to make street lights that would meet the quality standards for Brazil. We went to Eletrobras, the largest utility in Brazil, and we said to them, look, you have a mandate to do energy efficiency projects for your country, but you're not good at it. All you do is build dams and hydro projects and transmission lines, and they said, yeah, that's true, we're not good at it. So we said, how about if you just gave us some engineers and basically created like an underwriter's laboratory so you could test and certify these made-in-Brazil lights so that the cities would have comfort in the warranty and that the products would work. So they said, sure. So they provided the technical assurance. And then we brought in one of our financial partners to create a $500 million special purpose finance vehicle that, by the way, the first funder in that vehicle was the Brazilian National Development Bank, who had said they wanted to do green projects but couldn't find good projects, and they weren't in the business of developing the projects. They said, bring them to me, and of course we'll put money into them. And so we created the special purpose finance vehicle so that now 13 cities will replace 1.5 million streetlights, save 67% of the energy and therefore greenhouse gases, excuse me, and they will obviously save the taxpayers a lot of money, and the payback is 3 to 5 years for products that are guaranteed to last 10 and will probably last 15. And it took a nonprofit 2 years to go there and to work between these partners who all wanted to do this, but none of them were expert in what the other guy wanted to hear or understand, whether it was the city understanding the finance community understanding the technology, et cetera, et cetera. So there was a role for the nonprofit to play in coordinating these activities, and it now unlocked $500 million worth of projects, which as that capital recycles, it'll be available to 5,600 cities in Brazil. And we can replicate this model in other places. Thus my point about if you want to do energy efficiency, you do streetlights first. So this is an example, and again, just a thought starter, not necessarily something we have to focus on, but I'm happy to answer any questions during the Q&A session. But now let's bring up the rest of our panelists, if I may call upon them, and let's get into a really good discussion about all of these issues. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Terry. So I will moderate a conversation here for a little while, and then we'll have some time for you all to ask questions. So we've seen this as a very interesting example, a sort of innovative approach to climate financing. I thought I'd start now with Bill and Lynn. First, Bill, do you see this model as having application to other sectors, the water sector or land issue or others, and how might it apply? And then we'll ask Lynn to sort of talk about what she's doing that fits within this general context.
Well, the identification of the practical problem and the resourcefulness to address it in a very sophisticated and very hands-on way that you did, I think lends itself to any number of issues. I particularly like the fact that this is, as you conceive this project, a subnational enterprise. I think there's going to be a necessity to work at that level to get the kind of financing we need, and recognize that the states in very many cases have made significant commitments in Paris, but the bar was very low. It was intentionally set low. It was set low so we would not have another failure. And I understand that, and I think that made sense. If you look back at the failures of the previous COPs, they were often disappointments because there were unrealistic targets and timetables put out by a number of parties, beginning in Rio in 1992. The encouraging thing about what Terry said, I think, is the engagement of so many parties who have to be involved if you're to address problems of this magnitude. It strikes me that you look at the commitments that were made in Paris, and they're very significant ones by the countries, and 195 of them, and it's tremendously satisfying to see that level of involvement and commitment to the issue and willingness to go out and make these commitments. There are just as many business leaders who made commitments of the same significance. That's new. If you had attended conferences of the parties, you go back to Rio. There are very few businessmen, business people, business leaders in Rio. Stefan Schmidheiny was one of the very few, wrote a very impressive book about financing and why good ideas often didn't qualify for financing and what financiers needed. Well, the business community was in Paris, and if you look at any number of the commitments that were made, whether by individuals as investors, pension funds, institutions, they are also contingent. They're contingent on finding the deals. They're not necessarily, many of them, going to engage, I think, systematically in the kind of development exercise that R20 has done. But they're going to need somebody who does, because you've got this edifice of multiple interdependent contingencies. And the governments, any number of the governments, have made very clear they are bottoming their commitments on the availability of financing. Very often that's foreign direct investment. The international aid and lending institutions are not going to have sufficient capital. And I think the number that I've seen for wind and solar alone on the part of India and China is $2 trillion, trillion with a T. That's just for one sector. That's not for the kind of efficiency investments Terry described and all of the range of both adaptation and mitigation policies that many of these countries undertake. I've worked in the developing world. I'm also very conscious of the fact that if you look at India today, they've had 2 failed monsoons. Their largest, their highest dam is not producing power, and it's not producing water. And so they're taking trains and buses and trucks are delivering water to villages. Brazil's obviously preoccupied as well with corruption and their low commodities prices and the economic problems. There are a lot of distractions that are going to compete, honestly, with climate. And somebody's going to have to work very hard, and I think there's a serious need for leadership to do this in the financial community, who tries to help put together not something on the scale of billions, but really it's going to have to be trillions if we're to meet the commitments that have been set. I'm not discouraged that we might. I mean, we didn't have the commitments a few years ago, but we shouldn't be sanguine that all of this will just get done without a very significant scaling up of the current level of available funds.
Okay, thanks. Lynn, how does this approach fit in with the kind of things you're doing? I know talking with you at the Nature Conservancy, sort of investment and relationship of land to climate and those kinds of issues are high on your agenda. So could you sort of say how this might fit in with what you're doing and some reactions you might have?
Yeah, and let me tee off of things that both Bill and Terry said. And by the way, I was really invigorated with your presentation. I thought it was just really cool. Brought so many pieces together. But first start with the scale of the problem. I mean, we are talking trillions. And in fact, if you look at several recent reports that came out, just trying to tally up the dollar needs for the adaptation and mitigation components, just for those countries that actually reported a financial dimension to their commitments in Paris, you're talking about $150 billion a year for 10, 15 years. And again, those are just the subset that actually reported. So we're talking big dollars. But I want to add a couple of things into the mix. Thinking about these challenges is not only thinking about where do we get the monies and how might we do so in a way that generates return on investment that helps in replicability and scalability, but it also requires thinking about the solution set and asking how can we make that solution set more cost effective. And so part of what we're doing at the Nature Conservancy is looking at how we can put nature to work to address some of these challenges of climate change, both on the mitigation side, that is land-based solutions, whether it's forestry practices, agricultural practices, et cetera, but also on the adaptation side. So, for example, we have done a lot of work looking at coastal resilience, the effects of a changing climate, high-intensity storms, and the role that oyster reef restoration and/or coral reef restoration or sea marsh restoration plays in attenuating waves and storm surge, and therefore the effects from those extreme weather events. And what we find is they're highly effective in many circumstances and often at a fraction of the cost, for example, of the built environment. So part one of the solution is to look at how we can find cost-effective solutions and sometimes deploying nature. I'll give a second example because it's right here in DC. 700 cities in the United States face problems of stormwater overflow, combined sewage overflow exceedances, and many of them had thought the remedy is to rebuild all those 100-year-old pipes and tunnels that take the water and then drive it to a wastewater treatment facility and at great expense and lots of energy treat and address the problem. Billions of dollars. But a lot of folks began to think, and Philadelphia was a leader in this, so is Washington, D.C., how can we put nature to work? How can we use permeable surfacing? How can we do greening? And help to solve the problem, and again, at a fraction of the cost of the built environment. So here's where the Nature Conservancy comes in. we both look at that solution set, sort of better, cheaper, smarter, greener, if you will. But then we're a 60-year-old organization that fundamentally, we did conservation, but we also were financial innovators. I mean, we helped create the concept of land trusts, et cetera. So we've deployed that financial acumen, worked with the city of DC. They passed an ordinance saying any new commercial buildings have to address on site their stormwater, but in a market mechanism allowed for half of that to be offset by, for example, investing in green infrastructure. So we set up a company, working with some others, that would essentially create stormwater banks, go into low-income communities, work with those folks to transform their properties into bioswales and mechanisms that actually treat that stormwater. They get some revenue from it. The investors actually get a return on the investment as the building owners buy credits from those efforts. And there you have something that actually is ongoing and replicable. We're doing it in DC, but we hope and envision doing this in many other cities. So I'll stop there. We have a lot of other things we're working on, water funds I could talk about, but let me stop there so we can carry on the conversation.
Okay, great, thank you. I think the common theme in all this is you need people and organizations who invest in these things. So I wanted to maybe turn a little bit to investors and start with Terry. So in your program, Terry, what kinds of investors are likely to find, what kind of investors are you looking for? What are their perceptions of risk? Are they doing this for purely business reasons? Is there some sort of social motivation as well?
Well, the primary criteria is that they have money. After that, well, seriously, there are some, of course, that are doing program-related investing, and typically that's a foundation that may have an endowment, and they're willing to do that because it's high risk and may have to convert that to a grant, and so they're willing to do that. Others are doing mission-related investing, which typically means that it's lower risk and will have a return, but it might be a lower return, and again, putting their endowment so their money is where their mouth is. But there's an organization called Confluence Philanthropy that many of you may know, Dana Lanza, that was started out of the Rockefeller Brothers Foundation some years ago, and they are a group of foundations with endowments that have billions and billions of dollars of assets under management. And I went to speak to their opening plenary session in a room about this size with about this number of people, and all of the foundation executives who give away the money were sitting in the front row, and they were eager and writing down all kinds of notes. And you could tell who were the investment professionals. They were sitting in the back like this, literally. Right. And it was because, and of course, during the coffee break, it was like, look, don't tell me how to invest the money, because if it's not there for you to give away, you're not going to want to hear my excuses. But of course, the foundation folks were saying, yeah, but look, if we're giving away 5% a year and your 95% is invested in the Koch brothers and Exxon and those kinds of things, how can that ever be reconciled? So to answer your question, I think there's a lot of different appetites, and that's why we try to focus on things which don't make people make that choice, which give them market rate returns at market rate risks, and give project opportunities, and then private equity investors can come in and invest in the companies to meet that demand. For example, the company that was relatively new that now is going to be making millions of streetlights in Brazil. Will need a capital infusion, but knowing that the market is there, the investors are much more likely to step forward. At the institutional level, you may have heard last year how a number of large pension funds got together and created the Aligned Intermediaries program that was announced by the White House in June, and that was started by Jagdeep Bashir, the CIO of the UC Regents, University of California Regents Endowment. And that's because they would see deals in utility scale renewable energy finance, or various kinds of energy efficiency programs or fuels or whatever, and they'd say, okay, those are reasonable risks and returns, but it didn't fit neatly into one of their asset portfolios. So it wasn't quite infrastructure, it wasn't quite special situations, it wasn't quite this or that. And so you literally would have great projects and great investment opportunities going from door to door and being told to go down the hall until they kind of ran out of places to go. And so, and yet this is what, of course, these institutions are saying they want. Their treasurers, their board members are saying we need green, we want green to be part of this revolution. And so what they did was they said, all right, look, why don't we put together what turned out to be $4 billion from these 12 large pension funds and put that together in one pot and go learn and hire a staff to go meet that challenge of find us things that are truly green and sustainable, but meet the kind of risk and return profiles that a pension fund that, of course, can't tell the pensioners we're not going to give you a pension this week, that could meet that. And so now they're actually trying to invent what might be a whole new asset class. It might be climate finance asset class that would sit right alongside infrastructure and private equity and venture and so on and so forth as its own asset class. Or they're going to try to reinvent some of those existing asset classes to be more nimble to take advantage of these opportunities. But they're addressing it. And so I'd say both in the philanthropic side and in the institutional side, everyone's aware of the challenge and the demand, but they're still grappling with how they fit that square peg in their respective round holes.
Good. Bill, did you want to add anything to that, having organized a major fund?
Terry's story of the investors with their arms folded in the back of the hall reminded me, in raising money for Aqua, the international fund we had to invest in water in developing countries, I went to the Ford Foundation, among others, and that was one of the earlier ones. And I learned a couple of things there. One, as the woman who put it to me when I was talking about all of the social advantages of the investment we intended to finance and the severe problems of health and lack of availability for work and productivity and everything else because of poor sanitation in developing countries, she stopped me and she said, let me just make it perfectly clear. You want to talk about that stuff on the other side of the house? All they are interested here is return. Change the subject. And as I left one of the other meetings that we had, I was with an experienced professional of TPG, of which I was not at that point. And he said, as diplomatically as he could, he said, you know, you've got a great case that you make, and it's really so interesting to hear it, but maybe in future you could tone it down a little bit about the dead babies. The real world. Yeah. The really encouraging thing in the finance community is that as recently as 10 years ago, you did not have questions asked about environment, governance, safety so much. I mean, it came up if it was an obvious characteristic of a particular kind of investment, it posed that kind of risk. It was not a systematic part of the review. It is now. There was no one at TPG that was specifically professionally allocated to consider those questions. There are 4 professionals now, and now KKR and Carlyle, Goldman Sachs, they all have them. That's new. That's largely a result, I think, of the culture, but also of investment criteria. CalSTRS, CalPERS, major pension funds, university endowments, European, the Norwegian fund, all the rest of them, they ask those questions, which is very constructive. They're asking questions largely, however, about, most of them, I think, avoiding certain liabilities and making sure that your companies have good workplace rules and ethics and so forth in developing countries and other places. To a large extent, I don't think they're asking so specifically, where are the investments that solve social problems? They're attentive to them. They talk about those increasingly, and they didn't used to speak about them. That, with Paris, looked like it was going to change. And now there are specific commitments by SocGen, all sorts of institutions that are very large and respected in the financial world that would suggest they are looking actively for those kinds of investments. There's a little bit of a question now that they are willing to do that. Are we developing them? Who's going to do the work that Terry described, which is quite a lot of work, I must say. I don't know how long it took you, Terry. Yeah, I'm not surprised. And was it worth it to the investors? They did well. Well, one likes to hear that, but when you think of a lot of straightforward investment operators deploying the resources, having the ingenuity, the connections, the creativity to do that is asking a lot. I think there is a niche there that can be filled of developers who will undertake to do those projects, to identify them, who understand the importance of efficiency, for example, which somehow is always lost in the mix, and that's what you picked up. But that has to happen.
Yeah, yeah. Lynn, yeah, go ahead.
Let me add another angle to this as an individual in a large nonprofit organization. Going back to the scale of the challenges and then coupling that with the observation that they are many-faceted. So some of them pertain to how to enhance energy efficiency with city lights, but some of them pertain to how to bolster resilience along a coast against storms or reduce flooding impacts along rivers, many, many different kinds of challenges. And not all of them will necessarily lend themselves to traditional investment types of approaches. So one of the things that we strive to do at the Nature Conservancy is to put together sort of mix and match packages. So we have created an investment entity called Nature Vest. We teamed up with JP Morgan. It's a separate entity. It's a social impact investing entity. But it is one where we often pursue projects and investments where there may be some return on investment, but not necessarily at competitive market returns, but pair it up with some philanthropy and address some problems that might otherwise not be addressed, for example. So I want to suggest that there's a mix and match piece of the picture. The other thing I want to say is, you know, financing these efforts doesn't occur in a vacuum. You mentioned issues of risk. When we start to look at, for example, some of our nature-based solutions, we run into several other contextual challenges. One is insurance companies that know how to rate risk reduction of, let's say, building a seawall, but not risk reduction as it relates to, say, an oyster reef restoration. They know how to rate the risks associated with, say, a wastewater treatment plant and so forth, but not necessarily green infrastructure. So one of our challenges has been to work with insurance companies, and we are doing that, and get them to help us, work with us, and work with engineering companies to actually evaluate the performance of these green solutions that we pilot on a smallish scale, use that for them to learn from, and then build that into their risk assessments. So that's one piece. The second piece, though, and maybe this is the policy wonk in me, you know, a lot of these things also unfold in a policy context. So let me go back to DC. We could not do what we're now doing in DC with stormwater and greening had it not been, first of all, EPA that gave approval to greening solutions for stormwater, but secondly, then the city of DC to pass an ordinance that essentially required on-site addressing of the stormwater problem, which then creates the demand for that off-site set of credits so that we can create a company, build those credits, get the money, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, there's the risk piece, you got to address that. There's the policy piece that often confronts you. And then there's the, hey, is there somebody that's going to invest in this thing? And what's the rate of return? And if the rate of return isn't quite where it needs to be for all those guys with their arms crossed in the back, then you have to think creatively and say, well, can we sort of pair this up maybe with some of the philanthropic funding, which is what we're traditionally, you know, well positioned to do.
If I could just add on something you're saying there about the insurance companies. This is also a place where enlightened government policy comes in, and dare I say politics, trying to convince governments that it's actually in their self-interest to do something and to partner in this way. So, for example, in the mid-1980s already, the British government was alarmed by the fact that insurance companies were no longer writing insurance policies in the City of London because of climate risk and flooding and so forth. And so the government, DEFRA went in and spoke to the insurance companies and said, what is it that we would have to do as a government to get you back in insuring these very valuable properties? They put together a $4 billion action plan, which in those days was, or £4 billion was a lot of money in those days, to do things like move transformers from below ground to above ground and do a variety of other things. They built those stronger seawall gates. They did some natural habitat restoration and so on. 4 billion pounds that the insurance companies estimated would avert 80 billion pounds worth of damages. So when the insurance companies convinced the government to spend that money, that eliminated any politics that would have gotten in the way, at least in our country, of getting that kind of an investment made. And then obviously everyone benefited, because sure enough, you can now buy an insurance policy in the City of London again.
You know, one of the other things we're doing, not so much right here in the United States, but for example in Mexico, is teaming up with insurance companies in the tourism industry and the Mexican government, looking at coastal resilience and getting the tourism companies to recognize the risks associated with failure to enhance resilience by investing in coral reef restoration and getting them to invest in that restoration, both because it directly relates to their business proposition in tourism, but then it also reduces the risk of their infrastructure along the coast.
By the way, you wonder what would have happened if our government had been as progressive and looked at these kinds of risks in New Orleans and even here in New York before hurricanes Katrina and Sandy.
You know, a little factoid on that, I got to put this in there. So when I was at the Interior Department, the U.S. Geological Survey came to me and pointed out that, and this is a rough and crude number, but for about each 2.7 miles of sea marsh, you actually abate storm surge by a foot. Well, we've lost 100 miles of sea marsh along the Gulf Coast. You do the math, what was a 30-foot storm surge that hit way out at sea and was only a foot by the time it hit New Orleans is now 30 feet because all that buffer is gone. You know, so nature does make a difference. Investing in it can be a really potentially cost-effective solution.
Green infrastructure is really increasingly recognized, and I think one of the important points here is that a lot of very good things are happening at the local level. They have been undertaken when the Congress was not so interested in the issue, but irrespective of ideology, the mayor of Chicago brought together the people from the various universities in his town, quite a number of significant ones, and without any attempt to try to assign causes, simply asked what is the best scenario for the future in terms of heat and impacts of climate change on waterfall and the rest. And they came up with it and invented permeable pavement and began to install it all over. They tripled the size of their emergency rooms because they're predicting a threefold increase in heat stroke victims as a consequence of many more days. It's like 3 times more days above 95 degrees in the summertime. They a whole new set of plants that actually they don't plant the Illinois ash. It's the tree of the state of Illinois. Norway spruce, maple. They plant Alabama sweet gum. And that's the plant zone that they're increasingly in. Very creative stuff, and people know about the green roofs and a lot of the other things that they've done. They're expecting a different waterfall history, much like California's. Nothing between April or May and November in future. Very constructive, very non-ideological. It's never became an issue in the way that it is nationally on whether you accept or not that humans are contributing to it. The question wasn't asked. Non-ideological mayor, not known for being particularly green, made it happen. I think there are other examples. Bloomberg did considerable things there. And even before then, when I was in government, we had a proposal to, well, the Safe Drinking Water Act required that a big drinking water facility be constructed by New York City at the cost of well in excess of $1 billion. And a number of people, including some environmental groups, came together and proposed that instead of that, we try to preserve the watershed, protect the green area, make sure it didn't get contaminated, keep Giardia and some of the animals out of it. And the long and the short of it was the city essentially paid for that to happen. It needed an exemption, a very unpopular one in our water staff at EPA at the time because they didn't like exempting from the Safe Drinking Water Act. And I must say, to my amazement, it worked. I thought that we were buying time for New York, maybe 3 to 5 years, see if it worked, and it was clearly going to achieve a number of very important conservation objectives and greening the farms, keeping the farmland in production and the rest. Well, the farmers made money on it, landowners made money on it, and New York saved a bundle on it. That was...
Yeah. So taking a page from New York, and which has kind of become the poster child of these watershed protection efforts to enhance stormwater, and going back to the finance thing, one of the things the Nature Conservancy has done, recognizing the value of that approach, is to work in cities around the world. So we've now got about 30 what we call water funds, and another 30 or so underway. The first one we did was in Quito, and there the idea was, can you invest in the watershed and better management practices, whether it's better forestry practices, better agricultural practices, to reduce sedimentation and or reduce also any chemical runoff and so forth, the effect of which is to reduce the treatment costs in the city. And if there is that cost saving, and it turns out there is, can you use ratepayer money and steer it to investment in that watershed rather than, for example, in a tertiary treatment plant or more water treatment? The interesting thing in this, and this gets back to the finance question, is, of course, in many developing countries, you don't have a water utility, you don't have ratepayers paying money for their water service, and so you don't really have that resource. So we've actually found that we can team up with companies, companies like Coca-Cola and others, who are really dependent on clean water, and help us invest in the watershed, basically to secure clean water for themselves, but by the way, the city benefits as well.
Mm-hmm. Let me just turn to those are great examples, and it shows that you can make cost-effective investments, and you can make a case. And I like the point about measuring the performance of natural systems. But I was talking with someone in the venture capital business recently, my friend Judd over there, and he was talking about how a lot of good investment possibilities can be higher risk because you're investing in different countries with different legal systems and different sort of political contexts and that sort of thing. Is that a big issue? Are there some countries that are going to be disadvantaged because of legal and political and other kinds of conditions?
Well, we certainly find that with the R20. I mean, obviously there are some countries that are just so corrupt or just so difficult to work with, or even bureaucratic. I mean, I have to say, working in India is very difficult. There's a certain level of corruption, but actually when you draw a lot of attention to a project, you don't see the political officials with their hand out because they know they're going to actually get positive attention, and that's kind of the payoff, if you will. But it's so bureaucratic that to do the project we did in Brazil in 2 years, and by the way, we're just starting to install those lights, so it's a total of a 5-year project, would take 3 times longer in India if you could get it done. That's not to say don't do it, but it is to say that you have to have local partners, and you do have to have more patience in some countries. And then look, there's also the risk of political upset. You might get something done quickly and very efficiently and very effectively, but then there's a change of government, and who knows what that means for nationalization. I mean, look at what's happening in Venezuela as an example. Used to be a great place to do business, and it sure isn't today. So, but look, I mean, I think, as I mentioned, that's one of the reasons with the R20 we like to work with all 500 of our subnational governments, because at any given time, there may be better places to work to replicate these things, to bring down the cost of many of these things by doing, for example, more LED streetlights in any part of the world helps bring down the cost for every part of the world.
Right. The priority, I think, will be to invest in companies. And to the extent that you can invest in companies that either have a preferred relationship with the government or at least are capable of functioning in those environments, which a lot of outsiders will not be, you'll be better off. To the extent you have to invest in government projects, infrastructure, and others, it's as Terry described it. You may find that you wait a long time to get decisions made. Then when the decisions are made, they're not made transparently. And you have all sorts of reasons, and one of them is politics that you have to cope with. I remember we thought in our fund, Judd and I and others, that we would invest in privatizations. The World Bank was encouraging, the IFC was, and they achieved some tremendous results in extending water to more people and sanitation to more people, particularly in Buenos Aires when we got into it. Well, it turned out that projects would be announced, deferred, I remember in one case, our representative in Brazil called and said, I don't know what you're thinking, but in this particular city, I not only know who's taking the money for that project, I know how much they're getting. Okay, guess we will pass that one on up. That's a very big issue. Mohammed Ibrahim has spoken eloquently about how much it holds back African development, that there is the level of corruption, and he's, as many of you know, the Ibrahim Prize, he's not been able to award for most of the years that it's been out, with these lists for a head of state who leaves with an honest reputation. And that's one of those issues, and it's impossible to look at the climate issue separate from many of these other issues. They're going to have to. The international community, the extent that this is taken as seriously as it should be, there's going to have to be very strong leadership to try to get some equivalent to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. I'm a huge enthusiast for the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which isn't able to lay out a lot of money often, but we learned, I'm a member of President Obama's Global Development Council, 9-member group that's advising on priorities in the remaining time we have. And the extraordinary thing about the existence of the criteria that the Millennium Challenge Corporation has established promotes progressive forces in the countries that don't qualify. So without even laying out money, it has a positive influence. I think that's really marvelous. We really need much more rigor, though, and attention to that issue, because it relates to achieving all the other things that we're hoping to achieve.
Okay, thanks. Before we go to the audience questions, I just want to get a quick response on one question. This is like in the presidential debates, only we're not going to ask anything embarrassing. But if you could pick one technology issue, challenge to really move a lot of capital in, what would it be? Terry, what would be the top of your list?
It's what I mentioned before, it's waste. We're putting in landfills or burning just prodigious quantities of natural resources that could create enormous jobs and keep us from having to march armies around the world to secure the next barrel of oil or other natural resources, deforestation, a lot of things that I know Lynn cares greatly about, we all do, but Nature Conservancy works in. So to me, tackling waste is the biggest opportunity as well as one of the biggest threats.
Okay, Lynn?
You know, I'm tempted to say ditto because I think that's really right on, and it goes beyond waste in the sense of garbage, and also takes the form of waste heat. Mm-hmm. Huge amounts of lost waste heat that, if captured technologically, could tremendously enhance energy efficiency and so forth. But I'm going to put a different one on the table since Terry started with waste. And I'm going to say, from the standpoint of climate change, a continuing and really big challenge, it is one we can address, is transportation. Because the transportation fuel sector is just a tougher nut to crack. And you know, particularly when you get into airlines, and there are just some really tough physical characteristics that make it difficult to address that in a low carbon way.
Okay, thank you. Bill?
I would say too, as far as technologies are concerned, batteries. Once we do get the kind of batteries that so many people, Elon Musk and others, are working hard to get, DARPA has funded all sorts of research and technology, and we solve the intermittency problem, we will see an even more rapid uptake of renewables. That, I think, is likely to be in our future. One must hope it is. Certainly a lot of money and effort going into it, but that will change the dynamic significantly, I think, here and around the world. But I will also add something else. If you look at the expected construction, the new development, the new housing, the new buildings that are anticipated for India, China, and a lot of other fast-growing developing countries, Africa also, you have to posit the way those buildings are laid out, the urban planning, the efficiency of the connections with transportation, the degree to which they're green and they have the kinds of built-in ecosystem management that Lynn was talking about, and the insulation and the efficiency of the appliances and the cars, the one hopes, electric cars, and that they're powered by something that's reliable and non-fossil fuel generated. That is a huge undertaking. I think the numbers are that those countries are going to add more construction, more buildings, more households in the next 30 years than presently exist in them. So that should be a very significant priority. The way that historically the Chinese cities particularly have been laid out, the modern Chinese cities, is very antipathetic to efficiency, to walking, to bicycling. And I think in some cities we've seen some changes from that, but not honestly in most of them. The blocks are so large, the walk even within inside them to the gate is daunting. And it's just not going to be efficient in so many ways that matter, quality of life among others, but particularly with respect to its implications for climate.
Great. Excellent choices. Thank you. We have a little bit of time now for your questions. So if you'd like to ask a question, and this being Washington, you can tell us your name and who you're affiliated with. And if I repeat your question, it's not because I think we're all deaf, it's because we're recording this and we want to make sure we get it on the recording. So Alan?
Thank you. I'm Alan Heck with EPA. Thank you all for a terrific panel discussion. This is a question mainly for the United States, of course, for EPA. The flexibility of the success of something like green infrastructure came about from flexibility in existing regulations and willingness of government to work with industry. So my question is, looking at the next number of years ahead, where is there more flexibility needed in the EPA? And are we doing a good job in really being collaborative and partnering with the right business sector to achieve the kind of results that you're talking about?
Okay, so the question is on the role of sort of public policy, really, and regulation specifically. Where could EPA offer more flexibility? How good of a job has it been doing? So it really gets to this sort of how regulation affects these kinds of decisions. Bill, I think you work for a regulatory agency.
I was going to give this one to Terry.
You do.
Well, if you look at the, as you well know, Alan, if you look at the two principal pillars of the commitments that President Obama made in Paris, they're both fragile. The Clean Power Rule, which has been contested by 27 states, and I have written, along with Bill Ruckelshaus, the first EPA administrator, have signed a brief that's pending before the Court of Appeals. They've just decided to delay further their hearing and hear it en banc, which no one's seen a precedent for before, but that's what they're going to do. That, if it does not survive, we are very unlikely to meet our Paris commitments. The other one is also fragile. It's the automobile fuel efficiency requirement of 54.5 miles per gallon. If we do achieve that, the kind of thing that Lynn was just talking about is wonderfully advanced. It reduces by more than 2 million barrels a day the requirement for fuels to cars and trucks in the United States. But it's also subject to periodic review. The new administration will be very crucial to keeping both of those. Now, where EPA is on all of that, I had the sense, and I've said publicly before, that I thought, looking at the power situation, that a very constructive approach might be to proceed place by place. EPA, this is a very hands-on kind of approach, admittedly, and not always practical, but to proceed to accommodate those coal-fired power plants subject to their agreement to phase out on a predictable schedule that goes for a number of years. Enough time to amortize them. Many of the oldest have been around long enough anyway. But try to avoid requiring companies to invest hundreds of millions of dollars in upgrades to accommodate conventional pollution requirements. Because if you do that, and I've seen this in the board that I'm on in Texas, if you do that, you risk locking in the commitment to amortize all that money, and it can be hundreds of millions of dollars for each plant. That kind of process, I think, is a constructive way to achieve objectives that are as ambitious as we want them to be in this field, and they also recognize some of the realities of local dependency on some of these plants. I have been very supportive of the Clean Power Rule and the kinds of adaptations that Gina McCarthy and Janet McCabe have made in response to comments and criticisms. I think quite a lot was done to make it much more practical and cost-effective. So I think they're doing very well. I really look at them and marvel at the constancy and the level of professional commitment in the midst of a period when all they've taken is grief. All they've done is been complained about. And they are the conscience of the country, and they have, I mean, the extraordinary thing to me, I was asked the other day yesterday to say some things about Trump, and one of the questions I posed is I said, well, really, in a campaign that has been so negative about the state of the country, the capacity of government, the effectiveness of our laws and lawmakers, at what point will you recognize the huge success that we have had in the environment in the United States? Greg Easterbrook referred to it as one of the two most successful social policies of the post-World War period, the other being Social Security. The same is true in foreign development and foreign assistance, which I can't say I knew before I joined the President's Global Development Council. Reduced the rate of child mortality in the last 15 years by more than half. Measles rates are down from 300,000 to polio, I think, 300,000 to 30. Measles rates are way down. Malaria is way down. All these health indicators, as a consequence of investment, largely by the United States, more than anyone else, and by the private sector, and the Gates Foundation is notably among them. Those successes need a lot more attention. And to the extent that they're acknowledged, I think people should feel a lot better about moving forward with these laws, and which the country otherwise is committed to. And it's really difficult to imagine how, if you were to eliminate EPA and go back to the states, you wouldn't create all the problems that were addressed when the organization was created. And they were largely a beggar-thy-neighbor set of policies on pollution to seduce industry to come to your state rather than the next.
The only thing I would add to that briefly is, as I mentioned before, my rule at California EPA was just ask myself, what would Bill do? And in a very literal sense, that's what we did in 2006 when we were trying to build constituency to pass California's Global Warming Solutions Act. We had a panel at the San Francisco City Hall that Bill was kind enough to come and sit on. And there was a representative from the cement industry who predicted that they would just take their business and go somewhere else if there was any kind of constraint on their ability to pollute carbon. And so while I fully agree that there needs to be some flexibility, you've got to listen, you've got to think carefully about the impacts of your decision, and you'd rather get to a result maybe a little bit longer if that's what it takes, as long as you get to the result, than be pedantic. That said, we couldn't let one of the most polluting industries in the state have its way. And so they didn't get any exemptions, and none of them have moved out of the state. So at some point, I think you do have to.
Cement's a pretty heavy product.
Yeah.
Carrying it around,
Yeah.
carrying it to Nevada is a big deal.
Yeah, so I mean, I do think at some point, yes, there's got to be flexibility, and you've got to understand both sides, but you also have to know where your bottom line is.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just one other comment on this. There's so much that could be said. You know, the irony of the Clean Power Plan is that in the draft form, it actually had two dimensions that were quite innovative. One actually allowing an energy efficiency pathway to success, and the other allowing a renewable energy pathway to success. Both of those sort of outside the fence solutions, i.e. not about doing something with your smokestack. And because of a lot of critique of that, the final rule changed, and it still has some flexibility with respect to the renewable piece. But I would suggest to that question, Alan, the challenge there did not reside with EPA. EPA was actually looking big picture and holistically and saying what might be some really creative pathways to a low carbon future here. And we get ourselves more tangled up as a country, legislatively and otherwise, that prevents that creativity from moving forward.
Okay. Judd, you had a question?
My name's Judd Hill. I'm a partner with an investment firm called Technological Service Partners.
You don't have your arms folded.
I know I did. And I'm proud to declare myself as an environmental capitalist, right? I've done it for 35 years. I was formerly Bill's partner. And I think one of our biggest challenges is to deal with this perceived, and we sometimes perpetrate ourselves, this kind of negative challenge that exists between capital and environmental opportunity. And that I argue that, you know, this perception that if you're going to embrace sustainable impact investing, environmental opportunities, you know, doing things clean and green, et cetera, that you as an investor have to accept something less than a market rate private equity return. And that's what you do to be an altruist, if you will, rather than an optimal capitalist. I argue the contrary, that you actually can do better than market returns in classic private equity if you understand what those opportunities are and you embrace them and you see them. And we do that in my firm, that we make better than average private equity returns by restoring wetlands, by better managing water rights, by recycling frack water, by smart farming and saving more water. And if you look at those opportunities and embrace them, you're a much better steward of the natural resources and you are a true environmentalist because you practice it. And you make great money for your limited partners. So I think we have to work to make sure we don't have this Trump wall of negativity, if you will, that if you're going to invest in the space, that you go to accept a lesser than market rate of return. I argue you get better than market rates of return by being sustainable in what you choose. So I appreciate it. Others have similar thoughts or views.
Okay, so yeah, so Judd is saying he's in the business and you don't have to sacrifice profit to make money in these sectors. So any final thoughts on?
Well, Judd will remember we made a lot of money in India on drip irrigation.
Yeah.
The country really needs it. It was losing 15 feet on the groundwater in Kerala, Maharashtra, and other states. And the second largest company there, we recapitalized. And the people who owned it after us made much more than we did, but we did okay. Yeah.
The only thing I'd add to that is the flip side of that, which I think investors are increasingly becoming aware of, is the risk of investing in business as usual. And I think that's what is finally going to flip the amount of money moving into, let's call it green, is that green is being seen as less risky compared to fossil fueled industries.
If I can just make one short comment. I've been amazed in the last year that I've been traveling the world talking to family offices that, so I'm told, there's about $25 trillion of family office capital transitioning from, if you will, the 80 or 90-year-olds to the 40-something-year-olds. And that next generation truly does care about sustainability and trying to do it smarter than better. And not just because they're Luddites or tree huggers, they want to protect that capital and also do well by doing good. And that's a lot of money that is now kind of rethinking its strategy that will better the environment in the long term.
I would
So,
add.
you know, sorry.
Go ahead.
You know, listening to the comments about investing in green, I want to sort of broaden our vision a little bit. Peter Drucker once wrote that entrepreneurism lies anywhere and everywhere. And I would say the same thought applies to thinking about sustainability and what is green. It doesn't reside just in a few anointed sectors or types of innovations, but indeed each and every firm that uses energy or uses materials and produces waste has an opportunity to do better, use less stuff, advance efficiencies, et cetera. And this is really important in the context of trying to get to the 1.5 degrees centigrade climate stabilization, because it's not going to be just about renewables here and a few selected investments there. It's really going to be transforming the way cities look, the way building materials are used, what they are, et cetera. And boy, there's opportunities for return on investment in all of the above.
I just wanted to add, apropos of Jed's point, there was a letter written, I think about 2 years ago, by David Swenson, who oversees the Yale Endowment Fund, which is considered to have been among the very best over the course of the entire period that he's been running it. And it was a letter to his portfolio managers. It was in response to the Ban Fossil Fuels campaign and some of the pressures that had been developed among students. But he said, you need to take the climate risk much more seriously than currently is the practice. And he went into considerable detail about how to do the analysis and how to plan for the future, the long-range future, and in particular sectors to take extreme care that you weren't getting into something that, because of new regulations and laws, social policies, the culture, made disadvantageous. It had a huge influence on a lot of very practical, hard-nosed people in the investment world, because Swenson's pretty much the gold standard in that world. I would encourage those of you, particularly investors here, might be skeptical of some of this here, to go back and read the Swenson letter, because everybody I know in investment, after that letter, it's a lot harder to disparage some of the kind of thinking that we were just hearing described.
Okay, excellent.
I'm going to excuse myself to go
we
catch
have
a plane.
to, we will excuse Terry. Terry, thank you very much.
No, not quite the opposite. Quite the opposite. I'm going to take all this wisdom on the road.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Terry. But we'll conclude here. We will transition into our reception. You'll have more time to talk about some of these issues with people. So thank you very much, Lynn and Bill, as always, a great friend of the university and the school. Three of the most interesting people, yes.